It gives me great pleasure to greet you all this morning on behalf of the San Diego Museum of Art. This is a particular proud moment for us as we present Gauguin to Warhol, 20th century icons from the Albright-Knox Gallery in Buffalo, New York. As you know, one of the oldest museums in this country, the Albright-Knox Art Gallery is also home to one of the world's finest collection of modern art. It is this selection of more than 75 works that inspired today's symposium, whose participants I am delighted to welcome. We have this morning a particularly distinguished panel of presenters, whose subjects, including Max Beckmann, Frida Kahlo, Willem de Kooning, and Ken Price, suggest the remarkable breadth of this exhibition, from post-impressionism to pop art. The milestones of modern art that comprise this exhibition stand as a tribute not only to their makers, this is a who is who of the modern masters, right? But also to the fearless and visionary patrons who acquired this work for the Albright-Knox Art Gallery. Indeed, it bears recalling as we survey this astonishing collection that these works entered the museum not as icons of modernism, but as challenging examples of contemporary art. A case in point is Pablo Picasso's La Toilette, an acquisition under Conger-Goodyear so controversial that it precipitated his departure from the museum's board. Featuring masterpieces by more than 40 artists, including Henri Toulouse-Lautrec, Henri Matisse, Georgia O'Keeffe, and Salvador Dalí, this exhibition also offers an opportunity to reconsider, in context, the outstanding 20th century works from the San Diego Museum of Art's own permanent collection, which I encourage you to visit today as well. Together, the works that make up this exhibition offer more than just a stunning array. Beginning with the birth of modernism in the late 19th century, the exhibition features only truly iconic works by Paul Gauguin and Pablo Picasso, as well as a host of post-impressionist masters, such as Van Gogh. Moving from strength to strength, and remaining in Paris, we witnessed the celebration of the modern city in paintings by Robert Delaunay and Fernand Léger, a theme reprised by Giacomo Balla in his truly iconic work of 1912, Dynamism of a Dog on a Leash. From surrealism to abstract expressionism, by way of European expressionism, we encounter the work of Joan Miró and Giorgio de Chirico, as well as Max Beckmann and Frida Kahlo, both of whom will be subject of talks this morning. Following on mid-century masterpieces of the New York School, by the likes of Willem de Kooning and Jackson Pollock, and monochromatic minimalism of Frank Stella and Agnes Martin, the show reaches a brilliant coda with sensational works of pop art by Roy Lichtenstein and Andy Warhol. When we learned more than 3 years ago that the Albright-Knox Gallery was planning a major touring exhibition of highlights from its collection, a project without precedent in its 150 years of history, we knew that this was an opportunity not to be missed, both for our museum and for the city of San Diego. It gives me a special pleasure, therefore, to host you at this historic moment for us. I can think of no better way to mark this occasion than with the program we have prepared for you today. To begin this morning's program, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Sally Yard. Sally Yard is professor of art history at the University of San Diego. She has written about art from the emergence of abstract expressionism in the United States to the relationship of art and its publics, whether in the contentious terrain of the US-Mexico border or the reflective realm of the museum garden. Her work on the relationship of art and its publics includes books and essays on Christo, Robert Irwin, Robert Smithson, Sophie Calle, as well as the Insight exhibitions in San Diego, Tijuana. She has also written about painting, including books and exhibition catalogs about Willem de Kooning, Francis Bacon, and Cy Twombly. Sally Yard is currently at work on a book with Robert Irwin. She joins us today to discuss Willem de Kooning's painting Gotham News. Sally, please join us in the stage.
I want to just reiterate what was observed, that this is the most extraordinary exhibition, and I hope that what my remarks will do is sort of lead you to looking that much more delightedly and energetically when you get to the works in the galleries. The thing that is so amazing about the exhibition is that it's not only a group of works by extraordinary artists, pivotal figures, but these are pivotal works. I have to say that I'm just like in awe of how the collection at Albright-Knox was put together. So I thought we would begin with a glimpse of the work in the exhibition Gotham News by Willem de Kooning, and I'll sketch out a little bit about his early life while we look at this work of 1955. Some of you probably have already seen this in the galleries, and again, like so many of the works, incredibly impressive that this is painted in 1955, acquired and given to the Albright-Knox that same year. I think it's just a really interesting aspect of how the collection was put together. In any case, as many of you may know, Willem de Kooning was born in Rotterdam, apprenticed as a commercial artist at the age of 12 when he left his sort of formal education, took up studying in the evenings at the Rotterdam Academy of Fine Arts, carried on in this way with his studies and work until he was 20, and by age 22, after 6 or 7 unsuccessful attempts, finally succeeded in stowing away to the United States. So he arrived in Newport News, he made his way to Hoboken, spent the first months of his life in this country living in a Dutch seaman's house in Hoboken, New Jersey, and then gradually settled in Manhattan within this first year. And that was the beginning of his going to the museums, the beginning of his meeting other artists, unknown at that point for the most part, of making his way. So I'm going to actually sort of begin the story in the mid-30s, or later 30s, of de Kooning, to take a peek at how de Kooning creates the paintings which are very often something other than what they appear in terms of their process, I guess we could say. So we're going to turn our attention to an image, and I'm going to show you 2 slides of this. The actual color of the image is, I think, a bit in between the 2 images that I'm going to show you. So here, 2 Standing Men of 1938. It's an image which is now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's about 5 feet tall, and I think probably as you first encounter this painting here or at the museum, you wonder if, if this is a work that is complete. And the question is a good one. During these years, and for many years, de Kooning had a terrifically difficult time deciding when a work was finished. He struggled with the notion of completion of a work. But that is not enough to explain what's actually going on here, I would say. So the things that would immediately strike me at first glance in this image are numerous. This incredible profusion of line around the hands of the figure, which suggest a kind of indecision, a kind of sketching, something other than what we expect to see in a sort of finished oil painting. In fact, here, as in many of these works of the 30s and 40s, de Kooning is using charcoal scribed into the oil surface of the paintings, creating literally this feel of drawing and materiality. And there's more, of course, the longer you look at the image. There is this suggestion of another position for the arm that was contemplated and sort of allowed to remain. The figure on the right has one arm sort of twisted away out of view, the other ending in this sort of strange bubble-like element, sort of seemingly grasped by the hand of the figure. And the longer you spend time looking at the image, the more actually the figure on the right particularly becomes puzzling. Indeed, it begins to look perhaps like the figure not of a standing man, but perhaps actually a woman. And the knickers seem to be covered by this sort of diaphanous, almost ballet dancer's sort of skirt. The chest seems to have perhaps a sort of satiny bodice, again, of a dress or dancer's costume. Even the suggestion of a kind of ephemeral sort of bouffant hairdo insinuates this sort of potential of seeing this man metamorphosed perhaps into a woman. Very interesting to realize how an image like this is suggested to de Kooning. So what I want to suggest is not a process of seeing an image, making an image, copying that image, something quite different, something about the suggestibility of one image to another image that plays throughout his career. So I wanted to show you a little drawing which is made earlier in the same year, probably, earlier in 1938, a little pencil drawing titled Self-Portrait with Imaginary Brother. And you can certainly see and I'm sorry, I think the slide is a little hard to read on the screen, but you can see that the little sort of figure on the right wears knickers, has this sort of open-necked shirt, actually holds a ball in his hand, which would appear to become the kind of bubble that we have in the painting. Similarly, the kind of jacket and so on of this figure over the waist of the trousers evokes what we have in the image of the figure on the left. De Kooning actually has said that he calls this self-portrait with imaginary brother. He has actually, or had, a real brother, but it was an image that struck him as incredibly poignant, actually, when he drew it. And it was an image that stuck in his imagination and probably led rather directly to the painting that we have. But it, too, was an image that was in a chain of associations, I think we could say, for de Kooning. So we have here de Kooning in a photograph taken by Rudy Burckhardt in about, probably in about 1936, in his studio in Manhattan. And he is standing in this photograph by his, at that point, neighbor, Rudy Burckhardt, in front of a painting that he's at work on. And it turns out almost certainly that this photograph, which had been taken by Burckhardt, must have been the original thing that struck him as so very poignant, because there seems little doubt that actually the sort of handling of the kind of cuffs and hand holding the ball here derives from a sort of recollection of these cuffs sticking out of the sort of hands in pockets and so on, the kind of boyishness of de Kooning next to his painted figure. A painting actually that was destroyed, never completed, as was the case with so many of de Kooning's works of the 1930s. Now, importantly, too, there is here yet another image lingering behind all of this in de Kooning's imagination, and it is an image by his dear friend Arshile Gorky. Gorky, who had arrived from Armenia at the age of 16 in the United States, and Gorky, whom de Kooning met probably within the first 12 months or so, or 2 years of his arrival in New York. Gorky, whom de Kooning would say somehow miraculously knew so much about everything that you wanted to think about looking at, that he simply attached himself to him. He knew that if he would stay with Gorky, he would forge ahead. In any case, Gorky had been working over a period of a decade, 1926 to 1936, roughly, on this image on the right of the artist and his mother. It's an image about the same size as the two standing men, actually, about 5 feet high. And there seems no doubt that the figure that de Kooning was painting, the figure that he didn't complete, that was destroyed, at least in its attire, its sort of demeanor, and so on, recalls for sure, the image of the young Gorky in this one of two paintings that Gorky worked on over this decade-long process. So we find this suggestibility of images with de Kooning as this kind of astonishing and remarkable ongoing process. Some of the drawings that Gorky did, as well as the photograph that was a kind of starting point for his painting. There is an utterly formidable, triumphant work by Gorky in the exhibition, The Liver is the Coxcomb, 1944. It is a grand work, one of the sort of great works of Gorky's, having arrived at a style that was without precedent, that really sort of announced his having arrived at his mature and compelling style. But back to the work, Two Standing Men for a moment, thinking about it. What we have, among other things, is certainly an image which also reflects the period of the 1930s. The crash of the stock market in 1929 obviously precipitated a melancholy sort of decade of difficulty and great economic trials throughout the United States, and certainly for artists such as Gorky and de Kooning, who arrived here on their own, under circumstances that left them to make their way. There is a feel that is perhaps captured in images like Two Standing Men of a rather pensive kind of decade. In 1935, the Works Progress Administration's art project had been launched. This was important because it allowed artists to work actually as artists and be paid as artists. I think it was 26 something a week, and this was a sort of steady income. De Kooning actually worked briefly with the WPA program, and would remark that it changed entirely his understanding of himself as an artist. Up until this point, he had thought of himself as someone who worked commercial art jobs, did house painting, did store window displays, and painted in the evenings on the weekends when he could. After this very brief stint, he thought of himself as an artist who did these odd jobs to support what he was doing. He was rather briskly sort of kicked off of the WPA project because he was, of course, not here legally. He had stowed away. It was, but it was decisive. A year after the painting that we're looking at was painted, there would be the first of a number of pivotal exhibitions for de Kooning. And one of the things that Gorky most certainly did was to sort of lure de Kooning to all of the, de Kooning surely would have done it himself, but they went together very often, to the museums and galleries of Manhattan. The Metropolitan Museum of Art, certainly a prime spot for de Kooning, the Museum of Modern Art, the galleries full of works that intrigued them. But in 1939, MoMA presents Picasso, 40 Years of His Art, and Elaine de Kooning would remark that this was staggering, as she put it, in its impact on de Kooning. It's in 1937 that de Kooning meets, actually, Elaine Freed, who would become Elaine de Kooning. She was a young art student, and Burckhardt, de Kooning's friend, the photographer, artist, remarked that I think it was love at first sight. Soon they lived together, painted together, kept the landlord from the door, got married, and were as close as two people can be to each other. Importantly, Elaine and her sister would become the models for a number of paintings, actually, and there would be a shift from images of men, such as Two Standing Men, which dominated the 1930s imagery of figures, toward the images of women that will dominate the 1940s. A photo of Bill and Elaine. So this portrait that we're looking at is in the style of that little pencil portrait of Elaine, and it's a lovely, sort of exquisitely rendered pencil likeness, actually apparently commissioned by someone, an image of his wife. The story goes that de Kooning actually did the image and presented it to the person who had requested it, but the hands were not complete. Actually, the hands were not visible, and the husband who'd commissioned this of his wife insisted actually that the hands sort of be completed, and we see them here in this sort of form that de Kooning revised. But it signaled something. De Kooning would observe through the 1940s, actually, as well as the late 30s, that he was incredibly confounded, irritated by rendering shoulders, hands, and hair, as well as foreshortened thighs of his figures. It wasn't because he couldn't do it. He certainly could draw these, he could paint them, but they weren't really going where he was going. So it's important, I think, for us to register where he was going. In a painting that no doubt finds its origin in the drawing, we again can assure ourselves that de Kooning is willfully moving away from the more keen likenesses of images like the pencil drawing. This seated woman of 1940 is in the collection of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. It again involves charcoal scribed into the oil paint of the surface of a painting painted on wood. In fact. And what we see is, of course, in this image, this vibrant color, this appearance again of, it would seem almost like a drawing, trying out multiple different sort of poses and positions. The obvious transformation of the arms, shoulders, and so on of the figure. But something I think to note here is that we could consider what he's doing, for example, in the alternate sort of poses of legs suggested, which will play out in many paintings, is a kind of willful insinuation of this quality of drawing in some ways, as we could think of it, into the images. Something I would dub a kind of willful pentimento, but I'll sort of flesh that idea out in an instant with another painting. I wanted to just show you quickly a photo of Elaine sort of posed in front of the seated woman in progress behind her. And I wanted to introduce us then to Woman Sitting, another of these paintings of women, this of 1943-44, again, oil and charcoal on board, in fact. And here this notion of a kind of willful pentimento I think is very vivid. So we have here the figure seated in a chair, but we have a second chair, this almost candy-striped sort of pink and white chair that is quite visible beyond. The look of de Kooning perhaps sort of trying out slightly different, sort of positions for the head. Now full-blown, the hands that disturbed him nowhere to be seen, in fact, in the image. Foreshortening of the legs really sort of gotten rid of by a kind of blur of pushing the figure's legs sideways, posed sort of like I am sideways, you can't see me on a chair. And so on, as he develops this. This sort of willful pentimento, I think, important. So pentimento is something that happens when an underdrawing or underimage comes to the surface. And it happens in the most unexpected ways at times, where actually something that had been thought of, painted out by an artist because of chemical processes over time actually materializes. This happened at one point with an image in the Timken Museum, where literally one day there was a figure that had not been there before. I think it was in the cranberry harvest, if my memory's right. But that's an accident when it happens in that kind of case. This, I would say, not at all, not an accident, on purpose. So again, this sense of process, this sense of deliberation, of a kind of artist sort of working through things would seem to be, I would say, the impression here. There's much that is in de Kooning's imagination at this point. Surely he is thinking of Picasso in terms of pose. One thinks of something like Picasso's Woman with a Book of 1932, which he would have seen in the exhibition of 1939. The revelation of the sort of nipples of the breasts, as in de Kooning's painting, obviously the pose of the figure, but dramatically the handlessness of this contrasting with the fan-like sort of melding of hand and pages of book in the image by Picasso. Mirror picture on the wall, sort of summarized as we see it here. Again, the thought perhaps of another position maybe for the arm of the figure suggested here, as well as multiple or alternate ideas for the chair. Now, there are other antecedents for actually the sort of exposure of the breasts of the figure. The 19th century artist Ang here, painting Mariancina, a drawing, a tiny, tiny drawing, about 4 inches high, of Mariancina of about 1840. And what, again, we want to know is that de Kooning actually thought this all through incredibly carefully once again. The look of process is counterfeit. It's feigned. I mean, it isn't process in the sense that he can't make up his mind. He knows exactly what he's doing. So this figure shows up as one of a pair of studies on the back of a painting called Black Friday. These studies are probably from about 1943. He later on turned all of this over and actually completed a painting in 1948 called Black Friday, leaving these studies behind. You obviously see the connection here. And so too, the figure above will point both backwards and forwards. So it points backwards to any number of images, one of them, this image of about 1941 with its sort of collision of profiles cubistically, borrowed from this image, but maybe even more strikingly, points forward to de Kooning's Pink Lady of about 1944, again, oil and charcoal on panel, in which the head sort of tips upward, and now all of it is within this web of swirling, colliding line that sort of slaps the profiles together and both describes and sort of dismantles the figure, one might feel. The knees push sideways, flattening out that projection of three-dimensionality, the sort of flurry of line, both describing particularly the breasts as a persistent three-dimensional element in de Kooning's work that fights against, then on the other hand, the kind of overtaking of the form, the push and pull of color, like an exercise of Hans Hofmann, red, green, and yellow, doing their advancing and receding. De Kooning, it would seem, is stuck on the figure and is, on the other hand, doing away with how, since the Renaissance, forms would be described three-dimensionally in space. He's thinking still, of course, of Picasso, this weeping woman, one of a whole series of weeping women of the 1930s that are entangled with the imagery of Guernica, amongst other things, surely is yet another precedent for the kind of figure that we have here, and certainly, among other things, for the globular sort of mascarade eyes that we have in the de Kooning painting. We have here Queen of Hearts, an image of 1943-46. I want to just simply continue along showing a sense of process. Here, one of the drawings that clearly sort of is part of the thinking through of the painting, these bold passages of color, creating a kind of abstract, fluctuating space, pressing forward and backward. What could be three-dimensional description also becoming sort of shape as we look at this in this beautiful tension, I guess we could feel, that plays out in de Kooning's work at this point. There are very few men, actually, in the images of the 1940s, and when they do appear, they appear somewhat as they do here, in this little image on paper, oil on paper image, two figures of about 1947. That is, they appear, generally speaking, frozen, mannequin-like, or in crucifixion images. The kind of nature of the images of men is very particular, in fact, during these years. De Kooning would, by the end of the 40s, robustly forge ahead with abstractions. We could say setting the scene for Gotham News in some ways, and I'm here showing you one of a series of black and white paintings as they are thought about, though they are not purely black and white, quite obviously, quite a vivid amount of color playing through them. Paintings exhibited in his first one-person exhibition in 1948 at Charles Egan Gallery. And he is now using not only oil paint, but enamel, because at this point, enamel, which he had used in commercial contexts, is immensely appealing for its fluidity, the ways in which he can create these sort of amazing plays of line. He will use all kinds of instruments and will use a liner's brush, something a sign painter might use, to get some of these very tendril-like, beautiful sort of long lines that we have. It would seem in looking at this image and others of this series that de Kooning now is forging ahead with abstraction. And one of the things I want to just very quickly point out is that there's a question here. When we look at the use of black and white, we might say here that white seems to be sort of an outlining element, but we might say here that black seems to be almost a kind of outlining element. What he's doing in black and white is confounding our command about what is figure and what is ground, what is the background, what is the mark. Again, part of this strategy of utterly undoing our conventional notions of space, representation, and so on, in his own way, mindful of Picasso, mindful of Cubism, but working this through as he makes his way. Now, what becomes immensely interesting about this and many other of de Kooning's images is, again, the suggestibility and linkages with other earlier images. And I want to remind you that these are the faces on the back of Black Friday. Black Friday is the painting that was completed on the front, as it were, of those studies. But what becomes really sort of marvelously indicative of de Kooning's ways of painting is that he was, during these years, also making a series of little images that seem related to Picasso's Demoiselle d'Avignon, actually some also to Picasso's Guernica, amongst many other Picasso images, such as this little image oil on paper, Pink Angel of 1947. And startlingly, we actually find, I think, that this figure in Pink Angel that is really based on a notorious figure in the lower right-hand corner, which I'll show you in a moment, of Picasso's Demoiselle d'Avignon, would seem subliminally at least to be figuring actually into the shapes we have here. A figure kind of submerged within this extraordinary sort of energetic field. And two, of this little series of images of 1947 and thereabouts, there is, for example, this painting, Untitled, Three Women, oil on paper once again, in which that figure moves sort of center stage and has now almost this suggestion of a bull's flicking ears and so on, as though Les Demoiselles d'Avignon and Guernica and its bull have kind of melded momentarily into Kooning's imagination. Here, the Demoiselle d'Avignon of Picasso, and the figure that I think must have been haunting de Kooning amongst many, many other images, that image of 1907. Painting of 1948, another of this series of the works, black and white, in de Kooning's first exhibition, though de Kooning will, particularly in Gotham News, actually seem to turn his attention away apparently from the figure. The figure shows up in the most persistent and sort of subliminal or sort of intuited ways throughout his work. I want to just sort of trace a little sort of lineage of seemingly perhaps abstract forms through warehouse mannequins of 1949, back to reclining nude Juliette Browner of 1938, and probably their linkages to very different sorts of images like Ingres' Grand Odalisque of 1814, and the Grisaille version of that, which is in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. 1949, de Kooning creates this kind of vehement, vociferous woman, and she too harks back again to Picasso, not because these are in any way emulations even of Picasso, only because de Kooning's imagination, I want to sort of just underscore, is constantly thinking of images as he arrives at his very own way of thinking of things. Picasso's Woman in an Armchair of 1929 on the right. Study for Woman by de Kooning of 1950, this beautiful little tiny, relatively speaking, sort of magazine-sized predecessor to the monumental scaled, confrontational scaled Woman 1 and those who will follow shortly, which contains within it a riveting smile, a smile that was borrowed from actually an advertisement on the back of Time magazine, the back cover. Every other week in these years of the late 40s, Time magazine had either a Camel cigarette ad or a Chesterfield cigarette ad. This was a Camel cigarette ad. We have this beguiling face of a woman with her T-zone in sort of indicated in a rather clinical sort of style. Mostly it was women, but there were occasionally men in these T-zone ads. And though you can't read it, as, essentially it's an extraordinary sort of, in many ways, heartbreaking period piece in which we find that the ads promote cigarettes as this healthful solution. Why have that, sort of fattening dessert when you can have just a cigarette at the end of a meal? And indeed, more doctors urge you onward to have a Camel rather than any other brand. Well, in any case, for de Kooning, this insinuation of women into this realm of advertising imagery was utterly fascinating. He couldn't believe it, looking out the window, trucks driving by with beguiling figures of women. It was extraordinary from his point of view. By 1951, the irascible 18 have appeared in an article in Life magazine, and this heralds and signals now a new sort of place for the abstract expressionists, de Kooning among them, together with a number of other figures in this exhibition. Woman 1, 1950-52, he works for 2 years on this image. She's 6 feet and a couple inches tall. And there are, again, many things playing through de Kooning's imagination as he thinks through this extraordinary image, in which the figure seems barely to hold her own against this painterly surround, the surround that will actually ultimately sort of engulf her when we come to images like Gotham News. Surely he's thinking of the figure ground sort of melding that will play out in Cubism, intimated in Picasso's Girl with a Mandolin of 1910. But he's thinking, too, of images like this standing male figure in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum. It's a Sumerian figure from 2600 BC, a small figure from, actually from Tel Asmar in what is now Iraq. He was thinking likewise of Giacometti. He had seen an extraordinary exhibition of Giacometti's work in 1948, which seemed to him, as Elaine de Kooning would say, like the work of a whole civilization. He was struck by it, and in that frozen pose of Giacometti's figure, we find an antecedent for this fearsome, I suppose, figure of Woman 1. De Kooning in the studio during these years, I'm going to show you just a couple images with no comment. Marilyn Monroe of 1954. Many of you will certainly remember the famous moment in The 7-Year Itch of 1954 in which Marilyn Monroe is standing on a sort of grate, subway grate or whatever, air situation in New York, and her dress blows up, and this supposedly was the final straw with Joe DiMaggio and the end of their somewhat difficult marriage. Monroe, who obviously will show up in the work of Warhol in many, many guises later on. Woman in Bicycle, 1952, 53, and then finally, by the time we hit 1955 and Gotham News, we find that that surround has become the painting. Tom Hess, a great advocate and critic and friend of de Kooning, would refer to this and other images of this moment of 1955 as urban landscapes, with their sense of the kind of pulsing energies and movement of the city. Here, as in other images of this moment, de Kooning would apply newspaper across the surfaces of these oil paintings so that the paint would dry more slowly. In this case, as in many paintings, he would allow that sort of offset of the newsprint to remain. It becomes a kind of shading, perhaps, and likewise insinuates popular cultural references into the images. In this case, for example, there's an advertisement for the movie To Catch a Thief, noting that it is starring Cary Grant and Grace Kelly. Here de Kooning actually in a photograph by Robert Frank, in which we see him sort of in this rather film noir-like kind of lighting at the end of the 50s, early 60s. I'm going to stop here, but I want to say only that the overarching sort of thread, I think, that links the use of pentimento, the sense of process, the illusion of impetuousness, is really essentially built around an understanding in de Kooning's work that plays out the longer you look at the work, that actually in the paintings he somewhat, I think we could say, enacts what he sees as sort of the human condition in part. Impulse versus will, action versus reflection, this counterplay of the impulse and the intention. And so, for example, when you look at Gotham News, those newsprint passages are going to draw you close because you, like me and everybody else, are curious. What is it that's there? What does it say? And that does exactly what de Kooning wants. You're up there looking at how the painting is made. And as you look at how the painting is made, you realize what looks random and slapdash is in fact incredibly calculated, incredibly carefully figured out. Corrected, like parry and, sort of parried and worked through. So really the thing is, have a great look at the painting, all the paintings, and they will reveal themselves, is what I would say. Good, thank you.